Rope is one that people hesitate to call a classic now, and it received mixed reviews upon its release, although it wound up being considered, to an extent, one of Hitchcock's more well-known films. Considering the vast sum of films he directed, this is certainly the case. Noted now for being Hitchcock's first colour film, his first collaborating with James Stewart, the real-time gimmick, and the uncharacteristic long takes, for the time especially. The most fascinating thing about the film, to me, is the degree to which its thematic priorities are manifest in the cinematographic ethos, whether this was conscious or not. The windows into the society distilled by Hitchcock, the camera snakes in through one window, the micro-world, as it looks over an exterior macro-world, plainly insinuating a hierarchical pathology endemic to the developed American metropolitan establishment. James Stewart's Rupert is an older man, eventually concerned that his ideas are warped and or have been warped by a younger generation, making him question the efficacy of such ideas in the first. The Übermensch ideation espoused by Brandon and Philip strikes us as reminiscent of fascist rhetoric now, celebrated by denizens of the nation who waged war with it just some years prior. To an audience now well attuned to the comparisons between fascist states of the 30s and 40s and the imperialistic or even racial supremacist tendencies of even the allied nations of the war, America, Britain, France, et al., the choice between a Nazi-run Germany and a post-war late 40s America is the choice between one's death and terminal boredom. The assertively repressive conformist inclination of America prior to the free speech/civil rights era, or at least the America between the 30s or 40s and the 50s/60s, is entirely an environment wherein a sympathy for fascism in all but name, prospectively, perhaps inevitably, crawls into the psyche of the pathologically entitled elites. This isn't to say that Hitchcock was attempting to illuminate the quasi-fascist undertones creeping in an effectively elitist establishment of the developed world, even if they applaud themselves for having trounced the Axis threat, although maybe he was, and he effectively does this via the emphasis on emotionally flattening brown textures, the deceptive veiling suits which distill a personal conformity or aspiration to designated successful archetypes, and also a front for a primal naked sadism that smirks inside, even motivates, the brains of these suits' wearers in the first. Also, consider the sweeping long takes themselves, which are at least partly popularized and initially demonstrated by the filmmakers of Nazi Germany. This could be disputed, as there may be more parallels elsewhere that I'm not recalling at this moment. Rather than sweeping over a cityscape, it explores the capitalist materialist interior, a blanketed manicured ideal abode for the prideful, passionately modern man. These bachelors pride status over the prospect of the then now old-school Christian family values, possibly inferring again, whether a filmmaker is conscious of this or not, the dissolution of those ideals of that of capitalist ladder swarming. In the emergent Cold War, these would replace the old Abrahamic religions as the justification for one's will to power, / the values of the United States, as espoused by its then newly globally domineering government. Status seeking in a market capitalist context is claimed to be a byproduct of an inevitable Darwinian chaos. The market will decide, the market knows best, survival of the fittest, whereas status seeking in a fascist context is, well, substitute market with power. The distinctions are really superficial. No one pretends that businesses suffered under Nazi rule. Industrial oligarchs thrived in the Nazi epoch both domestically in Germany and, at least initially, abroad, including infamously in the United States itself. Maybe I'm too fixated on Glaze as the zone of interest, but the covert fascism inevitable to any who see human societies as a spectrum of fortunate, exalted, and privileged, and others who will necessarily have notably less, whether in an authoritarian state, and not all authoritarian states claim to be fascist, some claim to be the complete political opposite, wanting to dissolve hierarchy altogether, or in a ruthlessly apathetic, market capitalist, superficially democratic state, has been now thoroughly exposed by Glazer. There is an appeal to having that which others don't, which has infected our species for most of its existence, and it is time for people to face up to the fact that their happiness might be dependent, whether they realize it or not, and if it is, they can change without too much difficulty, I genuinely feel, on having things which others don't. They might not be happy if everyone had an equally distributed sum of material privileges, let's say, even if said material privileges were very sufficient by our standards, not like what you imagine in a failed socialist state or a nation under war rations, say. The zone of interest exposes as eventual, pampered and dressed-up fascists, or fascists in all but name, those who obsess over their wealth and displays of financial intimidation, any who considers themselves more noble or virtuous by any particular context or circumstance of their human birth, and reputation-consumed Wes Anderson / minimal aesthetic drone millennial devotees whose ideals are thoroughly materialist and therefore dependent on a hierarchy of goods or well-being to be considered initially happy by their own standards. Privately, you have known people in your workplaces, in your social circles, even in your schooling years, who consider themselves superior to other people based upon highly frivolous reasons. How do you think the people feel who live in the large mansions, can decide the nature of your country's laws, who are born with certain aspirational body types, or who are otherwise given positions of influence in media, education, politics, or industry, able to affect the lives of millions upon millions of people because certain others deem them uniquely worthy of it? How do you think they feel? Do they feel modest, nervous, hoping to be up to the task, wishing there was someone else they feel or others felt was more qualified than them? What do you honestly, realistically think then? Funny, I was comparing Rope to Zone of Interest, and maybe more apt to compare it to the Coens, Barton Fink, for fairly similar reasons. Anyway, we'll close it here. Hopefully that was coherent at all.